Good evening. Why, thank you. My name is Danielle Dart, and I coordinate public programs for the Minnesota History Center. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the Minnesota Historical Society. We are still trying to seat people, so the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is if you have a seat next to you, please put your hand way up, channel your second grade self, put your hand way up and keep it up for just a little while because there are folks coming in and they need your help. Thank you so much. So you see where we've got some individual seats? Folks, yeah, you looking for those hands? Otherwise, people's hands are going to get tired. They're going to be sad. I promise we didn't oversell the lecture. We are not the airlines. But we do have a full house, and we'll probably have to continue seating people for a little while after it starts. Okay, you can put your hands down now. Thank you. I love how diligent Minnesotans are. Well, I know you're all glad to be here, as you should be, and I just want you to feel even more lucky. We had to turn away 100 people today after the lecture sold out, so you can consider yourselves sort of VIPs. Tonight's lecture is the first of 4 events that the Minnesota Historical Society is hosting this week to mark the 150th anniversary of the battles of Gettysburg and Vicksburg. You can find out more about those events in the handout that we gave you this evening. And I wanted to note, some of you asked about the exhibits. The exhibits are actually going to be open until 9. The Minnesota in the Civil War and the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 exhibits will be open until 9 o'clock. So if you're itching to see that Virginia battle flag, it's up on the 3rd floor, along with a lot of other wonderful artifacts and information. But that was the specific question, not surprising. Also, I wanted you to note that our speaker will be signing copies of his book outside the store right where you checked in and did your will call. Okay? So 150 years ago this evening, the soldiers of the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment were camped outside the tiny Pennsylvania farming town of Gettysburg, awaiting battle against the Confederate forces of Robert E. Lee. The actions of the 1st Minnesota at Gettysburg were pivotal to the Union's tide-turning victory there. The courage and sacrifice shown by the men of the 1st Minnesota at Gettysburg on July 2nd and July 3rd of 1863 are deeply embedded in the identity of the state and its people. Tonight, we gather to mark the anniversary of their service to the Union with this special lecture. Our speaker, Richard Moe, has served many roles over the past decades. He began his career in politics, first as chairman of the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party, then as chief of staff to Walter Mondale when Walter Mondale was senator and vice president, and then as senior staff to President Jimmy Carter. A lifelong advocate for historic preservation, Moe is former president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation and recipient of the Vincent Scully Prize for exemplary practice and scholarship in historic preservation. Also a longtime friend to the Minnesota Historical Society, Moe has collaborated with MHS on historic preservation issues here, and after the death of his mother, he established the Virginia Moe Fund at MHS for the acquisition of historic photographs, without which we would have a hard time telling the story of our state. Finally, Richard Moe is an author. His newest book, Roosevelt's Second Act, The Election of 1940 and the Politics of War, will be published in September by Oxford University Press. Tonight, he is here as the author of Last Full Measure, The Life and Death of the 1st Minnesota Volunteers, the definitive history of the storied Civil War fighting force. Please welcome him to the stage.
Thank you very much, Danielle. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I thought Minnesotans didn't go anywhere on Monday nights, but here you are putting a lie to that for sure. I'm really so touched to be here with all of you, and particularly to commemorate this 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, which, as you know, just resonates with significance and meaning, not just here in Minnesota, but for our entire country still, after all this time. I love the Minnesota Historical Society. I've been a member as long as I can remember. And one of the things you should know about this place is it does probably a better job of preserving, interpreting, and sharing the history of its state than any other state historical society, and I've seen a lot of them. This is also the largest historical society in the country, 24,000 members. I'm sure many of you are members. 24,000 members. In terms of interpreting and exhibiting history, do take in those exhibits up on the third floor, second floor, third floor, of the Minnesotans who fought in the Civil War and of the Dakota Wars. I just saw them myself for the first time, and believe me, they're very much worth seeing. I'm so pleased that the Minnesota Historical Society Press has kept my book in print all these years, 20 years later. Thank you, press. And thank goodness for the interest in the Civil War. This is a story that started with me 50 years ago. I was a young man working in the state capitol in the early 1960s. And to be in that state capitol is to be surrounded by Civil War memorabilia, statues, portraits, battle flags, uniforms, they're all there. And I went up there again this morning just to be reminded of all that. And they're still there. I didn't pay much attention to it then, but I knew something significant had happened regarding a Minnesota regiment, particularly at Gettysburg. But it wasn't until 25 years later that I really focused on it. And you may recall Ken Burns came out with his classic series, PBS series on the Civil War. And what that taught me was that there was a body of literature on the Civil War that I at least had not explored or even been aware of. And that was literature in the form of letters and diaries of the men who served in various regiments, north and south, and who wrote home, and who kept diaries, and who wrote eloquently, even if their syntax and their grammar was not always perfect, and it wasn't. You could nonetheless understand exactly what they were trying to say. And that was really a catalytic moment for me. And I decided to look into the background of all that stuff I'd seen at the Capitol 25 years before. And thanks to the historians here at the Minnesota Historical Society, and may I say, at the wonderful volunteers who staff the county historical societies all over this state, people who just can't do enough for you, can't do enough for history. I discovered that there was a body of literature here too, having to do with the 1st Minnesota. And I saw what they had gone through, what they had done. And unfortunately, I concluded the story had been lost over time because memories had faded in the century or more since the 1st Minnesota fought. There was obviously nobody living to remind us of it. And there frankly had not been a good book written about it since the time of the event itself. And I thought I was very fortunate to have an opportunity to take this literature, to take these letters and diaries, and to try to tell the story of the 1st Minnesota through the words of the men themselves. This was not going to be a book about grand strategy of the Civil War, or even grand strategy of the Battle of Gettysburg, but rather to try to see the events of this war through their eyes and literally through their words. And this became very important in appreciating this literature, because it was the first war in American history where many men, if not most men, could write. And it was the last war in which they could write freely, because censorship was imposed in World War I, and diaries were discouraged, if not prohibited. So this was a unique window into the minds of fighting men. And I decided I would dive into it, and I happily did. I think the story of how the 1st Minnesota came into being is fairly well known. Governor Ramsey happened to be in Washington at the time that the news of Fort Sumter came. He rushed to the War Department and told Secretary of War Cameron, "I pledge 1,000 men for the 1st Regiment." And it was because of that act that that the 1st Minnesota was known as the first regiment that was offered to Lincoln after Fort Sumter. There was a rush of patriotism throughout the North as a result of this attack on Fort Sumter. And in river towns all over southern Minnesota, particularly southeastern Minnesota, men rushed to enlist. Each of these towns was to form a separate company in the 1st Minnesota. Red Wing, Faribault, Stillwater, Hastings, Owatonna, Wabasha, St. Paul, Minneapolis, St. Anthony. St. Anthony was then a separate community. They all formed their own companies, and they came together at Fort Snelling, of course, to be trained. Minnesota was then the newest state in the nation, in the Union. It had only been a state for 3 years. And Minnesotans were very proud of this fact, and they wanted to prove that they were part of the United States of America in every sense. And that added to their sense of patriotism and their eagerness to serve. Minnesota, as I say, had only been a state for 3 years. During the decade of the 1850s, the population of Minnesota had soared from 10,000 men and women and children to 200,000. There was a massive campaign underway to recruit people to come to Minnesota, not just from the East and the other parts of the Midwest, but also from Europe. And of course, the rich farmland of southern Minnesota was a great attraction. And so they came in huge numbers, and they settled in farms. There were some 400 towns. Only 10 of those towns had populations of greater than 1,000. So it was very much a rural, small-town kind of community. And the people, the young men that enlisted in this regiment, they were of all kinds, but most of them, as I say, were quite young. Matthew Marvin was the 22-year-old clerk in a leather shop in Winona. Charlie Goddard, he was also from Winona. He was 15 years old, passed for 18. Josiah King, who claimed to be the first member of the regiment, to be the first man to enlist in the entire Union. That has never been conclusively proved, nor has it been disproved. And enough of his friends believed him that they had constructed a monument over here by the cathedral in his honor, and that I'm told still stands. William Loughran was a 29-year-old Irishman, an attorney in Minneapolis, and he was kind of the self-appointed historian of the regiment, and much of what we know about what they did is due to his writings. Edmund Stevens from Faribault, he was a correspondent. Every one of these communities had a newspaper, and every editor of those newspapers deputized one of the soldiers in that unit to be a correspondent. And they wrote under different names. Edmund Stevens wrote under the name of Raisins, and they had similar kinds of bylines. It obviously raised a lot of problems, especially when correspondents started criticizing their officers. That did not go down very well. And Edward Bassett was a farm boy from Rice County, and he kept a wonderful diary. Again, awful syntax, awful grammar, but wonderful sentiments. But I told the story principally through the diaries of Isaac and Henry Taylor, whose picture is on the cover of this book. I knew that Isaac Taylor had kept a diary because the society published it in 1944. I didn't know that Henry Taylor had. But I finally tracked down his granddaughter in Missouri, and she said, yes, he did keep a diary. But it's in the possession of my cousin, and he won't let anybody see it. He won't part with it. So I was forlorn. But then she called me back. Her name was Jean Barr, dear, dear woman. She said, I just learned that 2/3 of that diary had been reprinted in the Cass County, Missouri Democrat in 1938, and I've mailed it to you. So It made my day. Believe me, there is no greater excitement for a researcher than to get that kind of news. So I was able to tell this story largely through the diaries of Isaac and Henry Taylor. They both came from a farm family in Illinois, and they were both educated at a small college in Iowa, and they both came to Minnesota to be school teachers. They were very intelligent, had a great sense of values. Henry Taylor was a more serious soldier. He ended up being promoted to be sergeant. Isaac Taylor wasn't exactly a goof-off, but he didn't always have his mind on his soldiering. He was much more interested in the geology and the botany that he saw and the historic sites that he made note of, and he liked to write. Very easygoing. All of these men signed up for 3-month enlistments. Everybody thought this war was going to be over very quickly. And they also elected their own officers. William Colville, an attorney and editor in Red Wing, was elected the captain of his unit, of his company, and he eventually became the colonel of the regiment at the time of Gettysburg. That was typical. They trained at Fort Snelling, no uniforms, no equipment, sent east because Washington was threatened, totally unprepared. They camped under the unfinished Capitol, U.S. Capitol, and trained, drilled, again with no equipment, no uniforms. One of the members, Thomas Presnell, 18, from St. Paul, decided, well, I've heard of this President Lincoln, and I think I'll go meet him. So he made his way down to the White House, and he knocked on the door, and he asked for the president, and who should show up but President Lincoln. And he said, how do you do, sir? I'm Thomas Presnell, I'm from Minnesota. And the president said something to the effect of, that's very good, Private Presnell. Don't you think you should get back to your unit? Which he did. But it was that kind of looseness. I mean, there was not a lot of discipline anywhere, and there were very few rules. And what rules there were largely got ignored. Anyway, totally unprepared, this regiment was thrust into the First Battle of Bull Run. They had bad leadership at the commander level. They were wearing red shirts. So were the Alabamans wearing red shirts. And the 1st Minnesota got very badly shot up. Stonewall Jackson, as you know, came in from the north and tipped the difference. And the Union forces hightailed it back to Washington in a disaster, total disaster. They went up to Edwards Ferry, 30 miles northwest of Washington on the Potomac River, for 6 months, where they trained under General McClellan. And one thing about General McClellan is he knew how to form an army. He didn't know how to fight an army, but he knew how to form an army. And so the Army of the Potomac became very well trained. And I want to read you a passage because I want you to know how these men wrote and what they were thinking about. They did a lot of picket duty, which is just standing guard, basically. Across the Potomac, the Confederates were on one side, and obviously the 1st Minnesota was on the other side. And here's what Raisins wrote back to his newspaper in Faribault. The Confederates walked out on the sandbanks and conversed as friendly as they would have done a year ago. First past the usual morning salutations, then a few questions as to the price of whiskey on the Virginia side. Then followed a Union sentiment for both sides. The Union as it was, which was expressed in a wish to leave a little whiskey. Secesh then asked the day of the week, and one of the boys who happened to know answered that it was Sunday on our side. After a little more bantering, they entered into a general conversation. Both parties were in the Bull Run fight, and the only overcoats they possessed were left by our army and picked up on the road by them. They had been promised $10 per month, but had received no pay as yet, said they were badly fed and were tired of the business. They belonged to the 19th Virginia Regiment. Since our last picket fight, their pickets had been stationed half a mile back of the river. They had no personal spite against us, and our boys hadn't anything in particular against them. Each party invited the other to cross over and partake of a soldier's hospitality.
We know what that means. Secesh would come over, but had no boat, and some of our boys pushed out to go to them, but were stopped by our officers. The very sensible question was asked, but not satisfactorily answered: what are we fighting each other for? Would to God the people of all sections could thus have conversed with each other across the Potomac. Then they would have known each other better, and this unnatural war would have been avoided. That's how they wrote, that's how they thought at that point. That's before the war really got as intense as it did later. After they were trained at Edwards Ferry, General McClellan took them south to the peninsula, the famous Peninsula Campaign, which was a disaster, particularly the 7 days where McClellan kept winning victories but then retreating. He always thought he was outnumbered, and it was really an awful experience for the Union Army. And this is where Lincoln decided that he really had enough of General McClellan. In one of those battles of the 7 days was Savage Station, in which the Minnesotans again got shot up pretty badly. And Isaac and Henry Taylor, and this says volumes about who they were, they decided to stay behind and take care of their wounded and to allow themselves to be taken captive. How many men would do that? Well, they did. And they spent several months in a Confederate prison, Belle Isle, outside of Richmond, Virginia. And let me tell you what Isaac Taylor wrote about that experience, because again, it's very evocative. Most of them lay upon a hard floor with nothing but a single blanket under them. There a great many died that would have lived could they have had proper care. The despondence of some, I think, assisted materially in carrying them off. I believe that many died not from wounds or sickness, but simply because their spirits drooped. We tried to revive their spirits in every possible way. They frequently asked us to read the Richmond papers to them, and were particularly interested in anything that related to the Yankee prisoners. Occasionally, a woman with a well-filled basket of delicacies would visit our loathsome prison and distribute them to the most feeble. We also found some very kind friends among the Confederate soldiery, and should they ever fall into our hands, we shall be happy to return their kindness. Among them is Sergeant Hussey of the 2nd Mississippi Regiment. He would buy milk, berries, etc., and bring to those who were most severely wounded. That man should never want for anything without reach should he fall into our hands. These were extraordinary human beings. The Taylor brothers weren't exchanged for another couple of months, so they missed the Battle of Antietam, where the Minnesotans were again right in the thick of it, in the cornfield, and got very badly shot up. Then they went to Fredericksburg, which, as you know, was another Union disaster. General Joe Hooker ordered 13 waves of Union soldiers to go up Marie's Heights in the face of an overwhelming Confederate force that just mowed them down, one after another. General Alfred Sully, who was the son of the great American portrait artist, Thomas Sully, was the brigade commander. He had earlier been the colonel of the 1st Minnesota. He was a regular Army officer. He, it is believed, although there's nothing officially written about this, disobeyed an order to send the troops, including the 1st Minnesota, up in that 14th wave. He later said, I was not going to murder my men. And he paid a price for that. He was reassigned to duty in the West, which during the Civil War was not the place for a career Army officer to be. At Chancellorsville, the regiment's luck held again. They were only lightly engaged. And then they started the long and tortuous march north to Gettysburg. Robert E. Lee decided that his best chance of bringing the North to a resolution of this war, to force them to settle it, was to invade the North and to capture a city like Philadelphia, or better yet, Washington. So he was full of himself after Fredericksburg and after Chancellorsville, and he took his army of Northern Virginia into Pennsylvania. And General Meade, who at that point had replaced General McClellan, hurried after him. And of course, they met at this small town of Gettysburg. They gathered on Cemetery Ridge on the second day, and General Winfield Scott Hancock noticed that there was a gap in the Union lines. There was a gap in the Union lines because General Hancock commanded the Second Corps. The Third Corps was commanded by General Dan Sickles, who was not a professional soldier, and he was to the left of the Second Corps, and he didn't like his ground. He wanted to be on higher ground. So he moved his entire corps forward a half a mile, and that left a gap in the Union lines of 500 yards. Well, needless to say, the Confederates saw this gap and saw this opportunity, and they seized it, and they started sending men through it. And they stunned General Sickles' men, who turned tail and started retreating, and they started running over the Minnesotans, who were stationed at a critical point right in the middle of that gap on Cemetery Ridge, because that's where General Hancock had put them. It was a dire situation, midway between Cemetery Hill and a little round drop. If the Union lines had failed at that point, if the onrushing Confederates had gone through that gap, they would have literally rolled up the Union lines, and that would have been a total disaster. And that is what General Hancock saw as the danger. Excuse me. And I want to read to you how I saw this unfolding. Hancock had sent for reserves to plug the gap, but there was no way that they could arrive before the Confederates reached Cemetery Ridge. He urgently needed to delay their advance for 5 minutes, or for however much longer it would take for reinforcements to appear. According to Colville, Hancock looked at the 262 men of the 1st Minnesota and exclaimed, "My God, are all these the men we have here?" It was obvious that they were. And he then turned to the colonel, this is Colonel Colville, and asked, "What regiment is this?" "1st Minnesota," replied Colville. "Charge those lines," commanded Hancock, according to Loughran, the historian. Every man realized in an instant what that order meant. Death or wounds to us all. The sacrifice of the regiment to gain a few minutes' time and save the position and probably the battlefield, and every man saw and accepted the necessity for the sacrifice. There was no time for the men to reflect on the grim odds of surviving a charge against a vastly superior number of onrushing Confederates. According to Charles Muller, a 29-year-old French-born stonecutter from St. Paul, Colville stepped in front of the regiment and asked the men, "Will we go along?" And we answered yes. I immediately gave the order, "Forward double quick." And under a galling fire from the enemy, we advanced. Later, he recalled that the men started down the slopes in a beautiful line, which they tried hard to maintain as they quickened the pace. With bayonets fixed, officers and men were running downhill in a line extending nearly 100 yards from end to end. Although to call the incline a hill would be to exaggerate. It was an ever so gradual slope, extending 200 yards across 2 fields to the swale at the bottom, now heavy with smoke from Confederate firing. In a moment, according to Loughran, the regiment was sweeping down the slope directly upon the enemy's center. The full force of General Cadmus Wilcox's brigade of nearly 1,600 Alabamans was now focused on the 262 advancing Minnesotans, and artillery shelling combined with accurate musketry to deadly effect. "Bullets whistled past us," Carpenter said. "Shells screeched over us. Canister and grape fell about us. Comrade after comrade dropped from the ranks, but on the line went. No one took a second look at his fallen companion. We had no time to weep." I mean, you could just imagine what an incredibly traumatic moment this was. They stood on that line. They were ordered to charge. They knew exactly what was going to happen to them, and they went and did it. They went and did it. And there is no record of any man failing to join in that charge and to do his duty. They got to the bottom of the swale. There was no protection down there, and the Alabama riflemen were picking them off one by one. But finally darkness came and reinforcements came. It was an incredible feat. According to Loughran, of the 262 men, 215 lay on the field, and only 47 remained on the line. Some of these numbers are in dispute. Nobody knows exactly what the casualty rate was, but it was said at the time that there was an 82% casualty rate in this regiment on this particular day. And if so, that was the highest of any Union regiment in any battle in the Civil War. And there's no question but that they made the difference that Hancock wanted them to make. They stopped the Confederate charge through that line and literally saved the day. And the question is, how significant was the role of the 1st Minnesota? I think it was enormously significant. There were other significant events, obviously, elsewhere in the battlefield that day. And you can't say that this made all the difference, but it made a huge difference. Because if they hadn't held their line, if they hadn't done what they did, the Union lines would have been rolled up, and the battle would have had a different outcome, and perhaps the war would have had a different outcome. Because if the Union had lost the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln would have come under tremendous pressure to end this war on terms less than what he wanted to settle on. So it was a huge thing. And then they had to get up and fight the next day, and Pickett's charge, and in which there was brutal hand-to-hand combat, again involving the men from the 1st Minnesota. I want to read you another segment here that Henry Taylor wrote because he couldn't find his brother. He couldn't find his brother. He survived. Colonel Colville was badly wounded, along with virtually all of the officers were killed or wounded. A few days later, Henry Taylor wrote a letter to his sister, and here's what he wrote. Isaac was a brave soldier, and his calmness and coolness in action had been spoken of frequently by many of his comrades. I have always been proud of his conduct in battle. I rejoined the regiment about 10 p.m. and lay down in line of battle. The enemy had been repulsed, and we had held our position. The dead and wounded were all around me, but I must rest on arms and be ready for another battle. I slept a little. July 3rd, 8:30, a man of Company G, Snow, was coming up with coffee for some of the officers, and he saw Isaac lying dead. He told me he thought he saw my brother killed. I went with him to the spot and found it to be too true. Secured his things, knapsack, haversack, and canteen were gone. He probably threw them off when he went into action. I found a spade and took William E. Cundy and James L. Brown of Company E and went and dug his grave. We laid him down with all of his clothes on as he fell and spread a shelter tent over him. As we laid him down, I remarked, "Well, Isaac, all I can give you is a soldier's grave." I then sat down on a stone while the two comrades buried him. I was the only one to weep over his grave. His father, mother, brothers, and sisters were all ignorant of his death. But we must hurry back, for an engagement is momentarily expected. It was 10 o'clock when we finished burying. Some of Henry Taylor's writings after Isaac's death are some of the most poignant in the entire book. And I wish I could read more to you. As I said, he had to go on and fight in Pickett's charge, repulse Pickett's charge. As I say, this was a decisive moment in the battle, arguably the decisive moment, even though there were others. General Hancock said, "There is no more gallant deed recorded in history." Well, that could be argued, I suppose, but he stood in awe of what these men did. And it became a legendary regiment. There's no question about it. They were rewarded for their activity, if you can believe this, by being sent to New York to put down draft riots. It was actually fairly soft duty, and it was meant to be a reward. But this was the time of the draft riots in New York. And pretty soon their 3-year enlistments were running out. They were feted in Washington. Banquets were held. The vice president, most of the cabinet came, celebrated their achievements. They really were a legendary unit at this point. Much admired, much thanked. It was one of the most honored regiments in the war, but it was not really my intention in writing this book to glorify the war or even their heroic deeds, although they were heroic. Rather, it was to see the war as the reality that it was, through their eyes and through their words, of these ordinary men who did really extraordinary things. It was time to reflect on what this was all about, and the question that's always there: why did they fight? Well, here's how I tried to summarize that. The 1st Minnesota, when they headed back, and they headed back to Minnesota after their enlistments were up, the 1st Minnesota retraced the route that had brought it east nearly 3 years before, passing through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, before reaching La Crosse, Wisconsin, where the railroad ended. The men completed the final leg of their journey wrapped in buffalo robes and riding in horse-drawn sleighs over the 3-foot-thick ice of the Mississippi. They were almost home now, the war behind them, or at least behind those who had no plans to re-enlist. As they traveled up the frozen Mississippi, they surely thought back on the summer of 1861, when they had come down this river by steamboat. The trip then had been a frolic, almost as if they were on holiday. They were off on a great adventure that would be over quickly and successfully and at little cost. They had been brimming with enthusiasm, patriotism, and supreme confidence in themselves and their cause. They had also been brimming with innocence, the innocence of youth and inexperience. That innocence was lost forever at the First Battle of Bull Run, where they suffered staggering losses and bitter defeat. The frustration of the 7 days on the peninsula, winning battles and constantly in retreat, sapped their enthusiasm. Those early setbacks shook their confidence, but then victory at Antietam partially restored it. Their patriotism, their conviction that what they were doing was necessary to preserve their country, never wavered. They expressed it in different ways, but they universally believed in their country, and they were prepared to risk hardship, pain, and even death to preserve it. This was the belief that saw them through Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and finally Gettysburg. It saw them through the ineptitude of a seemingly endless string of Union commanders. It saw them through cold and wet nights, 22-hour marches, stale hardtack, and days without their cherished coffee. It would have seen them through Mine Run had the assault not been called off. What caused most of them to endure was duty, although few actually used the word. They questioned their superiors and virtually everything else in the Army at one time or another, but they never questioned the need to win the war. These were ordinary men, without pretense or guile, who happened to live at a time that was anything but ordinary. They had the same human shortcomings of any other group of men, but they also had an inner strength, perhaps stemming in part from life on the frontier, that helped them survive their incredible ordeal. The other thing that made them fight was that they were fighting for each other. They had been through 3 years of hell, with a man on their left and a man on their right, and they knew they couldn't let either one down. It's just as they wouldn't let him down. And this has been true through wars forever. So that's how I tried to sum it up. Abraham Lincoln, of course, summed it up much better when he came to Gettysburg 4 months later to pay tribute to those who gave the last full measure of devotion to their cause. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now we're going to get to the fun part, because I know there's a lot of Civil War experts out here, and you've got a lot of tough questions for me that I probably can't answer. But let's open it up for questions, and please speak loudly, and then I'll try to repeat your question for the audience. Yes, way in the back.